You smell like diesel and rust. I can't have you scaring my regulars." That's what the cafe owner said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The old man just stood there, silent. His hands still smelled of grease. He hadn't asked for much, just a cup of coffee and a seat near the window. But apparently that was too much for some people. "Go finish your breakfast somewhere that doesn't ruin the view," the owner added, smirking. The few customers in the room didn't say a word, but they watched. And the next morning, every table was full of men who looked just like him. Not one of them said a thing, but they didn't need to. If you believe dignity doesn't need noise to be heard, type honor in the comments. James Holloway wasn't there to prove anything. He just wanted a cup of coffee, a few minutes of quiet before the day began. But some people don't see quiet as strength. They see it as weakness. That was their first mistake. The morning air carried a hint of burnt oil and ocean salt. James Holloway stepped out of his garage before the sun had fully risen, wiping his hands on the same old rag he always kept tucked into his belt loop. His coveralls were worn thin at the knees. The patch above his heart faded but still legible. Holloway's auto, Est 1983. He'd been up since 5, not because he had to, but because that's how life had trained him. 3 tours in the Gulf will do that to a man. And when the VA told him retirement would be good for his nerves, he just smiled. He didn't need rest. He needed rhythm. And part of that rhythm was breakfast. Every Tuesday, without fail, James walked 6 blocks to the corner cafe, a small, sunlit place called the Maple Spoon. It wasn't fancy. Coffee was too weak, toast too dry. But it was quiet, predictable. And the window seat gave him just enough sunlight to warm the ache in his right knee. He liked that. That morning, he arrived as usual, 5 minutes before opening. He held the door politely for a woman pushing a stroller, nodded to the postman heading in for his usual to-go cup, and found his table by the window. He sat with a sigh, placed his cap on the seat beside him, and folded the rag from his pocket neatly on the table. He didn't need a menu. He never did. When the owner walked over, a man in his early 40s with a stiff apron and a tighter jaw, James gave him the usual nod. Black coffee, eggs scrambled, toast if it's not burnt. But this time, the owner didn't write anything down. He just looked at James, really looked. "You smell like diesel and rust," the man said, loud enough for others to hear. "I can't have you scaring my regulars." James blinked once, slowly, thought he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "I said," the owner repeated, stepping back slightly. "This isn't a garage, it's a cafe. I've got tourists, professionals, people who come here to relax. And you bring a certain vibe." James stayed still. He wasn't angry. Not yet, just confused. He looked around. A couple at the bar had stopped mid-bite. A young woman glanced up from her laptop, then quickly looked away. "I've been coming here for years," James said calmly. "Same order, same table." The owner crossed his arms. "Times change, and my business can't afford the look you bring." James stood, not fast, not slow. He adjusted his cap and took a breath so quiet it sounded like nothing at all. Then he looked the man in the eyes. "I served this country so people could live free," he said. "Even folks who don't know the value of silence." Then he walked out. No scene, no complaint, just the soft clink of the bell above the cafe door as it shut behind him. Inside, the room stayed still. Outside, James Holloway walked back toward the garage, the morning sun behind him, casting a long, quiet shadow. The clatter of the garage door echoed into the empty lot like a slow exhale. James Holloway didn't speak a word about what happened at the cafe. Not to the delivery driver who dropped off brake pads, not to the teenager who came by after school hoping to learn more about carburetors. He didn't rant, didn't vent. That wasn't his way, but something in him had shifted, not rage. James had met rage on foreign soil, in dust storms and ambushes and things you don't talk about after. This wasn't that. It was colder, cleaner, like something inside had quietly locked a door and thrown away the key. He worked through the morning without a break. The old Chevy in Bay 2 needed a timing belt. He replaced it with steady hands, checking and rechecking every bolt. He wiped his tools clean, lined them up in perfect order on the bench. When the teen, Tyler, asked him how to tell if a belt was worn, James just nodded and pointed. No words, just gesture. By 1 p.m., the sun was high and sharp, baking the concrete outside in white heat. James hadn't eaten. He didn't go back to the maple spoon. Instead, he poured himself a lukewarm coffee from the tin pot in the office, bitter, stale, and silent. He sat on the back steps where the metal handrail had long since lost its paint. From there, he could see the street. The cafe was just around the corner, close enough to remember, far enough to avoid. He watched the town pass by, a father pushing a stroller, a UPS truck, a woman from the city council office, a sheriff's cruiser with the window rolled down. The deputy gave a two-finger wave, and James returned it with a slow nod. None of them knew that a man who'd fixed their engines, refused payment from widows, and pulled 3 people from a flipped SUV last winter had been turned away from a diner like a stray dog. Not because he made noise, not because he caused trouble, but because his boots weren't clean enough, because his presence didn't match the polished image the owner wanted to sell. That stung more than he expected. Inside the garage, the phone rang twice. James ignored it. Probably a supplier. Or maybe not. Later that day, a white sedan pulled into the lot. A man in his early 60s stepped out, tan slacks, polo shirt tucked in. Retired military, by the look of him. Posture straight, eyes aware. He didn't walk toward the garage. He walked toward the back steps. "You James Holloway?" he asked. James didn't answer right away. Just took a sip of his bitter coffee. "Name's Dale," the man continued. "Saw what happened this morning. I was in the corner booth. Heard every word." Still no response. "You didn't deserve that." James looked at him then. Measured him. "I didn't ask for anything," he said. "I know," Dale replied. "That's why it matters." He handed James a folded piece of paper. No explanation, just a nod. Then he turned and left. James unfolded it slowly. On it, in small block letters, were just 3 lines. Wednesday, 8 a.m. Same table. Bring nothing. Say nothing. We'll handle it. He stared at the words, then folded the paper again, slid it into his chest pocket, and stood up. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked at the cafe in the distance. He wouldn't be alone tomorrow. Wednesday morning came with a heavy sky and the faint scent of rain on the breeze. James Holloway arrived at the garage earlier than usual. Not to work. The bays stayed closed, but out of habit. He cleaned the counters, checked the tool racks, wiped down a wrench that didn't need wiping. Anything to keep his hands moving. By 7:30 he was washed up and dressed, clean shirt, brushed hair, boots polished as best he could manage. He hadn't worn the old field jacket in years, the one with the faded unit patch on the shoulder. But that morning he did. At 7:55, he left the garage and turned down the sidewalk toward the Maple Spoon. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. As he approached the corner, he saw them. 2 men already standing near the cafe entrance, one in denim overalls, the other in a flannel shirt and Marine Corps cap. Neither spoke, just nodded when they saw him. He nodded back. Inside, the place was quieter than usual, but not empty. James stepped through the door. Every table by the windows was taken. Quiet men sat with coffee cups in hand, backs straight, eyes calm. A few wore service caps, Air Force, Navy, Army. Some didn't wear anything that marked them, but their posture told the story. Men who had stood at attention once, who still knew how to show up without making noise. James scanned the room. No one spoke, but chairs shifted. The usual corner table, his table, was empty, clean, a cup of black coffee already waiting. He walked over slowly and sat down. No one clapped. No one said welcome back, but they didn't need to. The owner stood behind the counter, stiff and pale. He recognized James immediately, but this time he didn't speak. He looked at the quiet crowd, the kind of crowd he never expected or wanted, and chose to stay silent. A waitress, not the owner, brought over a plate of scrambled eggs and dry toast, placed it gently in front of James. "On the house," she whispered. He gave a small nod. The room remained still. No music, no clatter, just quiet breathing and the occasional sound of coffee being poured, and then the door opened again. More men entered, older, some with canes. One in a wheelchair pushed by a younger guy who looked like he'd just left base last week. They filled the rest of the cafe. No talking, no posturing, just presence. At some point, someone flipped the closed sign on the door. The regulars who came by, curious, looked through the window and thought better of entering. The town wasn't used to this kind of gathering. Not loud, not violent, just immovable. James ate his breakfast slowly. He didn't look around much, didn't need to. He felt it. The quiet was no longer empty. It was shared. Near the back wall, Dale stood with his arms crossed, watching, satisfied, a small smirk at the corner of his mouth. When James finished, he placed the napkin neatly beside his plate and took one final sip of coffee. The waitress approached with the check. He looked at it. It read $0. Zero, thank you, Mr. Holloway, for everything. He folded it once and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he stood, and for the first time that morning, someone spoke. "See you next Wednesday?" one of the men near the door asked. James didn't answer, but he nodded, and that was enough. By Thursday, word had spread, not through newspapers or town meetings, but through whispers in barber shops, nods at gas stations, and glances exchanged at stoplights. Something had happened at the Maple Spoon, not a fight, not a protest, something else, something quieter and heavier. On Friday morning, the cafe opened as usual, but it didn't feel usual. The regulars came in, hesitant. The air felt different. There were still eggs on the griddle, coffee brewing, toast in the baskets. But now there were eyes watching, eyes that didn't glare or threaten, just watched. 3 men sat at the window table. They weren't loud, didn't dress to stand out, but they carried themselves like they knew how to hold a line. The owner, Greg Matheson, poured a fresh pot of coffee and kept his head down. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. Their presence said enough. By Saturday, the tables were full again. Not just veterans this time. Teachers, a mailman, the woman from City Hall. People who'd seen James Holloway under a car hood at some point in the last 2 decades. People who remembered how he always said, "Pay me later," or "Don't worry about it," when someone came up short. Some didn't know the full story, only that a quiet man had been turned away, and that others, quiet like him, had shown up in return. Greg started to feel it in his chest. He tried to ignore it. He wiped down menus twice, adjusted the radio volume, asked the waitress to smile more, but the tips were smaller, the stares longer, the atmosphere colder, and James hadn't returned. Not once. It was Monday morning when the deputy showed up. Deputy Clara Monroe, calm, composed, and with a badge that everyone respected. She ordered black coffee to go. Greg handed it over without making eye contact. Before she left, she looked him in the eye and said simply, "You're losing more than business." He didn't respond, but that night, he didn't sleep. By Wednesday, something had changed. Greg was behind the counter pretending to fix the syrup dispenser when the door opened and in walked 4 more veterans. Not young, not loud. One wore a neck brace, another leaned on a cane wrapped in duct tape. Behind them came 2 women from the town's church group, each holding a tray of baked goods. They walked past him without a word and gave them away to the men in uniform like it was a service, not charity. Greg finally cracked. He stepped into the back office, closed the door, and sat down hard. His wife, Marlene, knocked once and came in. "You're going to have to fix this," she said, arms crossed. "I didn't do anything," he muttered. That's exactly the problem. The silence stretched. "Call him," she said. Greg stared at the floor. "You don't have to like him," she added, "but you will respect him. Because if a man like James Holloway isn't welcome here, none of us should be." He didn't answer. But later that night, he found the number, typed it slowly, deleted it, typed again. When James picked up, he didn't speak at first. Greg cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway," he said, voice low, "I owe you more than an apology, but I'd like to start there." Silence. Then, "I'm listening," James replied. The following Wednesday, the sky was clear, bright but not loud. The kind of morning that carried no promises, just space for things to begin again. At exactly 7:58, James Holloway walked toward the Maple Spoon. He wore the same boots, same jacket, the same calm expression carved into the lines of his face. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, but because every step meant something. As he approached the cafe, the door was already open. Greg Matheson stood there waiting. No apron, no clipboard, just a man holding the door for another. "Morning," Greg said. James gave him a nod. Nothing more. Inside, the cafe wasn't packed this time. A few tables were filled, familiar faces. No organized show of force, just quiet, natural presence. People who'd come back not for spectacle, but to make something right again. James walked to his usual table, the one by the window. Waiting on the table was a small white card. He picked it up. "Reserved for those who serve in silence." No logo, no signatures. Just the table. Always open. The waitress, eyes softer than last week, brought over his usual. "Coffee. Eggs scrambled. Toast not burned," she said gently. He smiled. Just a little. Greg stood behind the counter, watching. Not hovering, just present. This time, he didn't try to explain. He didn't try to apologize again. He knew the moment had passed for words. But after James took his first sip of coffee, Greg walked to the back wall and did something unexpected. He reached up and unpinned the old chalkboard that listed Specials of the Week. In its place, he mounted a small wooden plaque. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a quiet click as the screws were fastened into place. People turned, watched. The plaque read, "This table is dedicated to James Holloway, not because he asked, but because he never had to." No applause followed, just silence and a different kind of weight. Respect not demanded, but earned. James didn't stand. He didn't speak. He simply kept eating. And when he finished, he folded the napkin, placed it beside the plate, and looked out the window for a moment longer than usual. The street was the same, but something in it had changed. He left a $10 bill under the plate, though the meal was free. Walked out without a word. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. A small boy on a bicycle passed by and gave a wave. James returned it with a nod. As he turned the corner, he paused for just a moment and looked back. Not at the cafe, but at the table by the window. Through the glass, it sat there, waiting for the next man or woman who might need it. A place that now knew the difference between noise and presence, between appearance and dignity. If you believe dignity doesn't need noise to be heard, type honor in the comments. At Tales of Dignity, we don't chase outrage. We follow the quiet footsteps of those who live with integrity, even when no one's watching. And if this story spoke to you, you'll want to watch what happens when power is abused, and one silent man refuses to be stepped on. He thought he was above the law, but this one mistake cost him big time. The next story is waiting. Subscribe, if you haven't already, not for the channel, but for the voices that still deserve to be heard. Until next time.